Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Maggie Favretti. She's actually an expert in design thinking and applying it to scenarios where communities have had disasters and tips and tricks on how to engage youth in the whole recovery process. So stay tuned. Hi, Maggie. Nice to be with you today.
Hi, Leanne. Great to be with you.
So thanks for doing this. Before we get started and talking about the topic today, can you just tell the viewers a little bit about your background?
Sure. I was an educator for 33 years in a pretty traditional classroom, but I was not a very traditional educator. My parents, who are my inspiration and were really my first teachers, raised me according to, well, really many more, but three unspoken essential principles. One is that we are all interlocking, necessary parts of communities and ecosystems. And another one was the love of learning and making things. With them, we could try anything as long as we studied up first. Learning by doing was also really, and with real responsibility, so that, instead of just being responsible for feeding the dog or walking the dog, we needed to decide what kind of dog would be the right dog for us to have and train it and decide what it should eat and how we should care for it and when it needed to go to the vet and when it needed to be put to sleep, and all of those decisions and the real consequences that come from them were on us, and in an age-appropriate way. But my parents really believed that young people learned and grew from actually having authentic responsibilities that mattered. And so once I became a cultural historian and a teacher, I always tried, both knowingly and unwittingly, tried to build in those principles into my teaching. They have so many benefits in child development and cognitive development. And I've come to learn that they're also so important for resilience and for healing from disaster and for thinking about how to make communities more resilient. So like one thing that happens is when young people are authentically engaged in community life, they are internally motivated, or their internal motivation is amplified. And so they learn that they can solve problems working with other people, and real problems. They learn that they are relevant, that they're dependent on, that they matter, and that they can affect change. And third, like when they're really engaged in this kind of learning, it's promoting their critical thinking, they're thinking across disciplines, they're deepening their content knowledge, and it's because they're actively and authentically engaged, it's making school relevant and giving it meaning in real time. It's not just like something you need to learn because you might use it someday. It's actually really important right now, and it's not like performance learning to pass the test. It's relevant and it's essential. And communities also become more resilient when they value and engage young people in civil society. So I think, from what I've seen, well, I taught for a while in what was called a high-performing school district, where for most of the kids, schooling was a performance, and that meant that it was superficial, and very externalized, right? So meeting out these external measures, they'd sit there at the end of their high school years and say, well, I've gotten straight A's, but I feel like I don't know how to do anything. And so I always tried to turn that around and make it so that kids could be healthy and happy and resilient, and they would create equitable and resilient communities. I think students are less vulnerable when they've learned this way because they have creative confidence, flexible system thinking, self-efficacy. They understand that they're not alone, that they are part of a community and they can work collaboratively to change things. And so after Hurricane Sandy, I was teaching right outside New York City. I created a public policy class called City 2.0, which applied design thinking to the question of how we could create more resilience in urban communities in and around New York. And that's what eventually brought me to Puerto Rico.
So tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in Puerto Rico over the past little while.
So when I first came to Puerto Rico, it was 2 weeks after the storms. Remember the double disasters of Irma and Maria, and on top of the disasters of colonialism and corruption, there was a serious humanitarian catastrophe there. And because of the City 2.0 class, the American Superintendents Association sent me there to sit with the Department of Education and to help them think through how they were going to get people back to school. So I worked with a few teachers and principals there, and we created a back to school guide for teachers that was filled with sort of trauma care and self-efficacy, confidence building activities, trying to reestablish some sense of routine, validate the problem solving capacities of the students and the teachers, and use that as the basis for return to project-based learning. So those relationships that I formed then have guided my involvement and my learning, connecting community recovery and resilience needs with school and university youth engagement. And of course, the engine for driving all of that are the educators, right? The adult allies who are facilitating this kind of engagement.
Yeah, I know. I was doing work with a community in northern Alberta after a wildfire, and the schools. It was a significant challenge. Not only the kids and kind of what that trauma had done to them as far as fire, but even getting substitute teachers, was a challenge because those teachers had to be off, and so the ripple effect. For kids, and trying to get those families back to normal as quickly as possible. Just that routine is important. Yeah.
Well, it really taught me that we need to pay a lot of attention to thinking about teachers of all kinds, not just K-12 teachers, but professors and community educators, as well as emotional first responders, because we are. And so the teachers need trauma care. They need to have access to their students. So, for example, in Montecito, California, where I met an amazing group of teachers doing this kind of work, they said the hardest thing for them was they couldn't get to the kids and the families that they knew so well and were, such a part, just because of the way that the debris slides happened. And so they could have access, if they were considered emotional first responders, they'd have access to care for themselves, training to care for the kids, and they'd have access to the kids that they wouldn't have to pay for. And so that's a direction that I feel like we really need to go. And in Puerto Rico, what's happening is that people are teaching themselves how to do this because it's needed. Yeah. And so, one of the cool things that I learned there is that, when the constraints are almost unbelievably high, right, overwhelming or insurmountable, there is also an amazing kind of energy for grassroots independence, in a way necessary, right, or no other choice kind of resilience and innovation. And what you can see in Puerto Rico are communities that are very proudly and independently relying on their old networks and their old wisdom to generate brand new food and water security systems, microgrids for energy, microeconomies that are based on anything from barter to Bitcoin. And like they're making use of everything that's available to them in the world, but defining it from a local perspective. And this is an incredible thing to learn from, and has been part of what I view how I can contribute, is that maybe what I can do is help to connect and support the kinds of community educators, university professors, and teachers who are working with young people, but also at the community level, to use design thinking as a way of accelerating and adding tools to the changes that they're already initiating.
So could you explain this process, how you would specifically use this type of approach with youth in communities?
Sure. Thank you for asking that. I'll try to keep it brief because it really varies a lot from community to community. But I'll give you one example of how it's working very well in Puerto Rico. So in that case, there's a public school in Bayamon that has become a design thinking, problem solving school. And they learned design thinking and did local redesign of the school first. And then they reached out to a local community and said, how can we work with you to help develop resilience in the community? And so with their community partners, they then began to use a design thinking process where they went and they met with people in the community. They surfaced what people's concerns were, as well as the ways in which the community was already very resilient. And they were able to identify those sort of strengths and needs in such a way that they could then start brainstorming about solutions that might help the community to continue to become more resilient and to assist in its recovery. And there was one team that went in the direction of, how can we use the community center or any empty space to develop community resilience when there's not a disaster and they're not in immediate recovery or response. And then so their work actually, the sort of curriculum or the programming that they came up with, which included, by the way, teaching people in the community, multi-generational and cross-sector people, how to use design thinking. They also had recreational programming and cultural events, as well as health and wellness oriented sort of learning sessions. And they were also interested in having it be like a co-working, innovation, co-learning space as well. And their work got picked up and published by one of our partners, Resilient C, SEE, which is a group of diaspora Puerto Rican architects and engineers based in Boston. And their work is published in a Resilient Community Guide. The other teams were working on things like better evacuation methods and mapping. How could you create a mental health wellness mobile clinic that would visit the community but also not be stigmatized? How could you create earthquake and flood-proof housing? And so these types of innovations are still sort of in the evolution phases. So when I go down in January, I'll be working with all of those different teams in using design thinking now to create implementation plans, find the right implementation partners, and bring these into reality. The one innovation that is already reality was advocating with the Puerto Rican Department of Education for the school to be available as an emergency shelter.
Oh, that's great.
That was because they had to break into the school in reality, because the school is in a flood zone. So technically it couldn't be a shelter.
Yeah.
However, in reality, it had to be.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great because I know, the work that I do, a lot of times it truly is so many different professionals have to come together with solutions because we all see this through a different lens. And if we choose to not include that lens, it's to our detriment. Like I think everybody should come to the table with solutions and perspectives and hopefully at the end of the day we can all come to something that makes sense. So
absolutely. Yeah, and that ecosystem of support around these kinds of youth engagement projects are not only critical to the success of the projects and the sustainability of the projects, but it also is a great learning experience for the kids. I mean, they're not only learning that their opinions are valued, but they're also learning about possible careers and ways to leverage their ideas into reality. That's unmatched. And so I'm hoping that we can continue that kind of work.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for the work you're doing and good luck when you go back there and implementing some of your solutions and your processes.
You.
And stay in touch.
Next step, Grand Challenges curriculum. So
great.
That kids are focusing on these problems from the time they enter school.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic.
Great.
Well, thanks again, Maggie.
Thanks, Leanne. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.